Bienvenido a Café Espacial, con la conducción del Dr. Fermín Romero Vázquez. Análisis con líderes expertos e influencers del futuro de las agencias espaciales globales. Exploración espacial y potencial expansión de la raza humana en el universo. Opinión en los ámbitos más prometedores del sector espacial por parte de sus protagonistas en gobierno, industria y servicios. Academias y ONG. Beneficios de la ciencia y tecnología espacial para toda la sociedad. Desde tierra firme es momento de un café. Café Espacial.
Hello, my friends. Welcome again to Café Espacial series. And this time we're very happy to have with us Dr. Namrata Goswami. Welcome, my dear Namrata.
Thank you for having me, Fermín. What a pleasure.
It is my pleasure. And let me introduce her because she's a very interesting person. So let's read his bio. Dr. Namrata Goswami is an author, professor, consultant specialized in space policy, international relations, and ethnic identity. She teaches at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University, the Joint Special Forces University, and is consultant for Space Fund Intelligence. She is a guest lecturer of Emory University of seminars on technology, society, and governance, and India Today. She was a subject matter expert in international affairs with the Futures Laboratory, Alabama. She worked as research fellow at MP Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, and visiting fellow at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway, La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, Institute of Peace, and was a Fulbright Senior Fellowship awardee. She was awarded at Minerva by the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense to study great powers competitions in outer space. In April 2019, Dr. Goswami testified before the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission on China's space program. Her co-authored the book, Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of the Space, which was published in 2020 by Lexington Press. Roman and Lightfield, her book on the Naga ethnic movement for a separate homeland, was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. She also has published widely to include The Diplomat, The Economic Times, The Washington Post, Ad Astra, Asia Policy, Live Encounters Magazine, Cairo Review. She was invited in November 2019 to share about her life and her work at the TEDx event held at the Rosa Parks Museum, Montgomery, Alabama. She's currently working on two academic books projects, one on China grand strategy of a nation of territoriality, and the other on space power theory and practice, case studies of US, China, India, Russia, and Japan. Very, very interesting. Probably you don't know, but usually I do the translation of the report on global counterspace capabilities of the Secure World Foundation. So I know what is this, my dear friend. Yeah. Welcome again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And, yes. And to introduce this interesting subject, which we are going to talking about right now, the space program of Japan in the commercial era. Let's say is that iSpace announced earlier this, that Hakuto, our mission, has a historic landing set for April 25. I mean, some days in advance, and of this month. And this is the main reason for what our guest is with us. So to start with this, let's say that Japan is changing the game of space powers, and the coming space lunar landing would mark a paradigm shift in the space operation, something that Japan is coming for over a decade. And let's start, and please tell us, my dear Namrata, what is the purpose of Japan's first commercial mission to the moon?
Sure, Fermín. So if you look at Japan's investment in space and space policy, so in around 2008, Japan issued a space policy guideline in which the focus was on developing the commercial capabilities of Japan. So this included Japanese citizens being able to utilize Japanese funding, JAXA, which is the Japanese aerospace company that is the government-funded organization. So the idea was that once we have commercial capability development, Japan will then support the commercial activities, for example, for missions to the moon, for national security development. So this particular mission is very interesting. So fast forward about 12, 13 years. In 2021, in December, Japan passed a space mining legislation that actually supports the iSpace mission that is on its way, in fact, entered lunar orbit and is about to land, as you said, if successful, on April 25th. So the idea is that this particular mission that iSpace, a Japanese space company, is taking is to be able to first to do two things, right? One is to land the first commercial landing on the lunar near side, and basically to show that they are able to do that as a commercial company. And secondly, to carry out the first resource extraction mission. So this particular mission, which iSpace is conducting, they signed a pre-agreed contract with NASA that once they have the lunar dust, they're going to then sell it to NASA as a proof of concept. So these are the two important missions that they are doing. And what Japan aims to achieve by this is that they're going to then open up the moon for commercial activity as a proof of concept. So those are the two missions that they are doing.
It is very interesting because they are working for governments like the US, which is really, well, being another different country, which is not US. So it's really, really interesting to see how these enterprises are moving to the commercial phase of the new space. And well, what is the importance of the Japanese company leading this mission? Please tell us, because probably maybe our audience doesn't know what is this commercial company.
Sure. So actually, for your audience, let's go back a little bit in history. So
yes, please.
In the US, they instituted a prize called the Google Lunar X Prize. Yes. So remember that at that time, there was a call that there will be a prize given to that particular commercial company that can go to the moon. And so iSpace was part of that particular Google Lunar X Prize. So they submitted their proposal for it, showcased their lunar lander capability, and said that they will achieve this in a particular deadline. And there were other companies too. India had Team Indus, Israel had Bereshit, SpaceIL. In fact, what is interesting for me is that Israeli company SpaceIL was about to land on the lunar near side in 2019 and failed in the last few seconds. So there was an attempt made commercially from Israel, but they did not succeed. The lunar lander crashed. And so the history of iSpace is that it starts from there. And so it's a Japanese commercial company. It is registered in Japan with offices in Luxembourg and in the US. So they have sister offices, but the main headquarters is in Japan. And then the iSpace is a very interesting company. So what it wants to do is that it wants to become like a shuttle service from the Earth to the moon to enable the commercial extraction of resources. So it is what is important is that iSpace wants to achieve this commercial capability and then to scale it up. So the first mission that we're about to witness, and if it successfully lands, will carry out the first resource extraction capability. Second, and this is where I think it is important to realize that iSpace is a very critical Japanese commercial company because Japan's government is supporting the company through their space mining legislation. So in the Outer Space Treaty, you cannot appropriate territory in space, as you know, and then you also have to make sure that you are not disallowing others from using that particular capability. But it does not stop utilization. So you can utilize the resources on the moon. And what is interesting is that Japan's iSpace mining license that has been given to the company to carry out this particular mission is very clear in terms of ownership as well. So this is again something that iSpace as a Japanese company is going to prove to the world. So what the Japan space mining legislation says is that once iSpace is able to extract that resource, it can own it and it can actually sell it. And this is under their obligation to the Outer Space Treaty. And so this is a very interesting development. One of my colleague, Timibi Aganaba, who teaches at Arizona State University, she says that, does this result in it becoming a state practice? Because countries like Japan, India, US, and Luxembourg have very similar positions on space resources. So that's what iSpace is. iSpace is a commercial space company wanting to develop space resource utilization, and very different from other commercial companies, which are only supply mechanisms, for example, launching of a rocket or sending humans to the International Space Station. iSpace is different. It's about the first commercial extraction of resource capability that this particular Japanese company is hoping to achieve.
Exactly. Only $50,000. The symbolic effect is deeply consequential for the future of the space resource economy. Do you know why this symbolic amount of this mission?
Yeah, it's actually 5,000. So it's actually less than 50,000. So this is because the symbolic amount, this is what NASA put out. So basically, because the activity has never been done before, and also, and let me build a little bit the picture. So the picture in terms of space resource extraction is very big. So the idea is that the moon has resources like helium-3 that can be used for nuclear propulsion capability. And then the moon has water ice that can be turned into oxygen for life support. The moon has oxygen again that can be turned into rocket fuel. The moon is also rich in rare earth minerals like platinum, iron ore, aluminum, titanium that can be used, silicon that can be used for construction purposes. So it's all lying there. We just do not have the capability to extract it as yet. And that is why the iSpace mission is so critical, because it is a symbolic mission to show to the world that companies can actually carry out business activity on the moon, that the lunar economy that is going to be trillions of dollars is possible. And that is why the symbolic value of 5,000, to show the world that this is the first case, the first business case. The second mission, of course, will be much more greater in terms of profit and return of profit. And by the time you extract resources, it's going to be trillions of dollars. So it's a very big economy that is waiting to happen.
Absolutely. I'm sure it will set a precedent that private space companies are able to sell the resources of the moon, which is incredible.
Yes, it's incredible, because I'll quickly say that the three countries that had such space resource legislation was the US, followed by Luxembourg, and then Japan. And just last week, India released its space policy document, in which now India also has the position that any Indian non-government entity, as you mentioned, private sector, is going to be able to keep the resources they extract on an asteroid and sell it. So you can see that more and more countries are starting to, especially major spacefaring nations like India, US, Japan, are starting to create the state practice with regard to space resources. So I think iSpace succeeding and its ability to carry out the first business activity is going to open up the lunar economy. So it's a big development, actually.
Yeah, of course, I agree. Well, the consequence of this mission has been lost amid the strategy analysis of the space economy. which is focused currently on satellite launches and reusable rockets like SpaceX we saw in a few days ago. What type of spacecraft is used in Japan for this mission? Please explain us.
Sure. So iSpace basically is sending a lander, which is called Hakuto R. And so this lander was released on the Falcon 9. And what is interesting is that, and this is very fascinating in terms of the mission dynamics itself, right? So what they are planning to achieve is to go on a much more longer path so that they can actually use a very low energy trajectory. So you're not going to use too much energy. And what you're going to use is that you're going to use the gravity of the sun and the earth, so which will include periodic firings from the mission. And then what is interesting is that the onboard thrusters will help you to come back to lunar orbit, but then they're taking a very long path, right? So that's one. The lander itself, which is Hakuto R, mission 1, is what iSpace is sending. Now, within the Hakuto R, there are 2 rovers. So, and this is again a first for me. So for your audience, they'll find it very interesting. So the Hakuto R lander is, of course, iSpace owned, but within the Hakuto R lander, there is a 22-pound rover called Rashid, which has been built by the United Arab Emirates. And once the Hakuto R lander lands, Rashid will be rolled out. And within Rashid, they have cameras to study the moon, as well as instruments to study the geology of the lunar surface. And so what is interesting is that the Hakuto R lander will be landing on the Atlas crater of the moon, which is the near side of the moon. It's the northeastern section of the moon. And it's about 87 kilometers, which is about 54 miles across. And just over 2 kilometers, 12 miles deep. So they're going to land there in that crater. And so, so that's one mission is, of course, the Rashid rover from the United Arab Emirates. And then the Hakuto R mission is also carrying an experimental solid state battery, which has been made by NGK Spark Plug, which is a Japanese-based spark plug company. And so this mission is going to see how batteries perform in space. And so one of the interesting things is that Takeshi Hakamada, who is iSpace CEO, mentioned that this particular mission is all about experimenting of, capabilities and strategies. Now, the other interesting thing is that there is another rover. So the first rover is the Rashid rover. You have the battery experiment. And then the final rover is JAXA's transformable lunar robot. So what they're going to do is that this particular robot it's a very lightweight robot, and this will also have instruments that will study lunar soil and study the lunar surface. And so these are the kind of studies that they're going to carry out when we have the lander land. And so the JAXA rover is very interesting because, again, commercial development of a rover you can see. So despite it being JAXA, which is a Japanese government company, you have partners like Sony, you have the Tomy company, and then you have Toshiba University that has contributed to that particular rover. And so the idea, Fermín, is that they're using the rovers to study the lunar soil, lunar radiation, lunar atmosphere, so that when the next mission, which will happen, I think, next year, in which iSpace will be sending a rover that is built in Luxembourg using Luxembourg space mining legislation. So they're going to scale it up. So after understanding the atmosphere of the moon with the first mission and the soil, the next mission will follow. So those are the kind of studies and scientific experiments that they're conducting with the Hakuto R mission. And of course, the final mission, which is the most critical mission, is to collect lunar dust on the lander's feet and then to sell it to NASA. So that's the most important mission.
Yeah, I know. Do you think these samples that they're going to be analyzed are the first step to be on the way for a good in situ resource utilization?
Yeah, that is the goal. That is the aim. So the idea is that there is a roadmap that they have developed. So if you look at iSpace and JAXA's website, which is the Japanese space company, they hope that by 2040, they will be able to achieve a research station, lunar settlement, and in situ resource utilization. So the basic idea is that once you're able to extract resources on the lunar surface, you will be able to use those resources with the help of automation, 3D printing, additive manufacturing to construct on the moon itself. And then you can use that as to the question you asked for in situ manufacturing and resource extraction for further missions, right? And I think there is an interesting strategic reason why companies and countries are interested in doing this. China also has a lunar mission that wants to build a research station on the moon and to extract resources, because Fermín, if you have seen the latest Starship test, you could see how difficult it is for a big rocket to take off and successfully enter low Earth orbit, right? And Earth is the deepest gravity well in the solar system, so you need a lot of fuel. The moon is 22 times more efficient than Earth. So if you're able to at least get your instruments, your extraction capability, and build it on the moon, the iSpace mission is going to open up that particular industry, is the hope.
Right. And regarding the Artemis Accords, what specific areas of the moon will the spacecraft explore?
So as I mentioned, in this particular case, so if you look at the Artemis Accord, where Japan is, of course, a signatory, and so is Mexico. And so I would say that there are three key words that come out, right? One is space resource utilization. Second, under the obligation of the Outer Space Treaty. And third, that the safety zone concept. So in this particular mission, which is not really connected to the Artemis mission, but forwards the idea of space resource utilization, because this is a commercial, basic commercial development, right, fully, and that it's a commercial landing. So this is going to develop space missions outside of, say, Artemis kind of accords, which are very state-driven, right, where states are members and participate. But I think how it will add to the Artemis Accord is that it is going to study, as I mentioned, the near side of the moon. It's going to study the lunar soil. It's going to study the lunar atmosphere and also analyze the resource prospecting capability. So what is the resources that are going to be there on the moon? And so I would think, Fermín, that in the long run, this will become a part of the Artemis Accord ecosystem, right? So if you look at the Artemis Accord ecosystem in the US itself, which is the lead actor, a lot of the capabilities that are being developed, for example, Starship launch system, a lunar lander, Intuitive Machine is building it, Astrobiotic is building it, Blue Origin is building it. So commercial development of capability for the Artemis mission is very high. So I would think that once iSpace succeeds, they will be the Japanese commercial contribution to the Artemis Accord in their study of the near side of the moon.
Excellent. Well, let's go to a brief pause, and then we will come back to continue talking on these very, very interesting issues.
Sure, thank you.
Como cosa del destino tuve en mi mente claridad. Puedo trazar un nuevo camino, contando día a día una verdad. El progreso no depende de otros, las ideas te dan libertad. Unidos somos más fuertes que cualquier fuerte tempestad. Trabajamos sin cansancio por ver al hermano sonreír, sabiendo que yo soy el cambio. Sí, doy más por mi país. Somos hijos de la misma tierra, herencia de lucha cultural. Dejamos en el corazón huella, como en un campo de nopal.
Muy bien, we're coming back again, and let's continue with this interesting talk with Dr. Namrata Goswami. Let's talk about how long will be this mission, my dear Namrata.
So it will depend. So that's a very interesting question. So as you know, they launched in December. They are taking a very long path to the moon, right? Usually you can do it much faster. But as I mentioned, from December to April, that's nearly 5 months of just traveling and getting into lunar orbit. They've successfully entered lunar orbit. Just before entering lunar orbit, they had some issues with their computers, but they have fixed that. So it's nearly 5 months of just, and that's because they wanted to save energy, right? To make it much more energy efficient. And then in terms of the mission itself, depends, right? So as far as I know, they're going to land, and then they're going to see whether they can extract those resources. The first will be the landing, right? Clinching the landing. Soft landing is very difficult. So that could happen in a day. The time they land, or they can change that to a later date. It will all depend on what they think about their electronics in their mission. And then in terms of the mission itself, as soon as they're able to study the lunar surface, it could be several months, or it could be, for example, a similar mission like that China launched called the Chang'e 4 to the far side of the moon. The rover is active since 2019 January, even today, right? So it's a very long mission. So it could be a continued mission depending on whether the two rovers, the Rashid rover and the JAXA rover, are able to sustain their life, right? So it could be a few months, but the activity itself should not take, I would suspect, that particular activity, the moment they have lunar dust and they extract it and they sell it, they prove their mission. So the idea is to prove two things, and that can happen very quickly. So they have not given us a timeline of how long the mission is, but just by looking at how other missions play out, I would give it a few months.
In analyzing the situation, what are the real chances of the spacecraft landing on the moon's surface or remain in orbit?
That's a great question, right? So it's really unknown. So because I will tell you, I say that because India tried to land on the similar lunar, very close to the lunar South Pole on a crater in 2019. And as you know, India is a very mature space power, has been able to enter lunar orbit before with the Chandrayaan-1 mission, but the Chandrayaan-2 mission failed in the last few seconds, right? Because the lunar landing, you have to slow down and it has to be soft landing, right? And so they had a very hard landing and the entire lander crashed. So now Bereshit, which tried a very similar landing, also crashed because they were not able to slow down, and there were electronics that went wrong. Now with Japan, the interesting point is that Japan does have experience of landing on an asteroid and getting samples, right? So, and that does not mean that iSpace, because it's developing its capability on its own, it might be a very different dynamic for the moon, right? So I will wait before I pass my judgment as to how successful they are. I am thinking that they have 80% chance of success, because they have simulated this several times in their lab. They have carried out similar soft landing. They have clinched the trajectory. So now with the actual demonstration, I would give it an 80% success. But the 20% uncertainty still remains, right? So if they're not able to slow down the lander as they get close to the moon, a hard landing would destroy their entire lander. So yeah, that's my assessment today in terms of success.
Which sounds great. And tell us, what are the potential benefits of these missions for Japan's space program and the global scientific community?
I think for Japan, there are three critical benefits. One is that if Japan's iSpace succeeds in this commercial mission, it will showcase Japan as an amazing contributor to space technology and commercial innovation, right? So that's number one, big benefit, because if Japan is the country that succeeds in landing the first commercial lander, it even goes forward vis-a-vis China and the US, right? And India. So becoming the first nation to do it in terms of commercial landing. The second important benefit for Japan is the important concept of earning profit out of a particular activity in space, right? Already iSpace has listed its, stocks in the Japan Stock Exchange. So already they are starting to make money and create money. So the second important benefit is earning economic resources globally from this. The final benefit that Japan would itself have and also offer a framework. So Fermín, even your own background in terms of creating regulation, right, in terms of space is so difficult. So I think what the Japanese mission will open up and benefit Japan and the world is that it will create the regulatory framework that actually enables this kind of activity and opens up the moon for a business activity, right?
Yes.
So, and this is really important because the usual understanding of space, and this is I think this is not to the benefit of people in the developing world and the rest of the world, right? So the usual understanding of space is from the superpower Cold War perspective, right? Where the developed world, and that's why I'm making it very clear, where the developed world, let's say the US and the Soviet Union at the time was very developed, decided that this is how space has to be framed, right? That we will not place weapons of mass destruction. There was no conversation about private activity in space. Developing nations' perspectives were not forwarded in the Outer Space Treaty and others, right? It appears like it is, but this has been framed by the Cold War discourse, right, of the superpower. So if Japan succeeds and creates a new regulatory environment, this will create an enormous opportunity for countries, say in Africa, which has established the African Space Agency, countries in Latin America, like Mexico and others, for them, this is a completely new development outside of the Cold War narrative where they can contribute, right? Because commercial space is democratizing space. And then developing countries in Asia and for example, I have seen interest from countries like Bangladesh. I've seen interest from countries like Malaysia, right? Indonesia. So it's a very important contribution to the world as well. So changing the narrative of the Cold War is very important.
Of course, I'm sure of that. And regarding the importance of business in this field, does this mission involve any international collaboration?
So if you look at the iSpace mission itself, it is a very commercial Japanese-led mission, right? So in terms of development of the lander itself. But then you see that there is collaboration, right? You have the United Arab Emirates, and that is again going to be a first, Fermín. So for the first time from the Arab world, you will have a rover from the UAE that will land on the lunar surface, a first for countries in the Middle East, right? So that's the international collaboration right there. You also saw international collaboration in terms of proofing that you can have resource prospecting on the moon between the US and Japan, right? So the NASA has a contract with iSpace, which is itself an international collaboration to prove that iSpace can engage in resource prospecting and that it'll sell it to NASA, as we mentioned before, as a proof of concept. So you see international collaboration there too.
Yes. How can we compare this company, iSpace, with companies in China, for example? China has an aggressive space program. They want to be the first space power in 2045. Which is the comparison between these Asian countries?
Oh, great question. That's my area of expertise. So, so if you look at how I compare, so one thing is that iSpace is already on its way, right, to the moon. China has several companies that want to build space ecosystem, as you know, including launch. They want to build satellites. I haven't seen a Chinese company talk about carrying out the first lunar commercial activity. In this particular activity, the state is funding a state China lunar exploration program that is under the China National Space Administration, the China Academy of Space Technology, that is building lunar capability to do commercial activity. So Bao Weiming, who is one of the chief architects of China's space program and a spokesperson, mentioned that China is hoping that by 2050, they will have about $10 trillion return annually from the lunar surface, right? So I would say that iSpace will be competing with the Japanese state-funded lunar program. And then the other important thing is that, and this is where I think the criticality comes, right? So, and that your question about how long this mission is going to be, how long it will survive is really important, because what China is hoping for is to build a permanent presence on the moon, right, by 2036. So it's not small missions like going there and coming back. It's about scaling up the activity, right? And so the comparison comes there. So, and there will be Chinese commercial activity that will happen as well, because China is now, as you said, on the path to developing their commercial space companies. There is a document called Document 60 that supports this from the State Council of the People's Republic of China. So as of today, iSpace, it feels like it's going to be the most amazing, game-changing event. Now it will depend on whether they can scale it up and continue their efforts of lunar resource extraction, which will mean that they will have to get funding, they will have to get international collaboration, and that they will have to be able to demonstrate that kind of scaling that China is hoping to do. So you can see that direct race right there. China is launching a lunar sample return mission next, which is a state mission, right? And so the comparison is right there.
Without any doubt, the space projection of the superpowers in the spaces is really amazing. And in that terms, and in the light of this Japanese commercial mission, in your opinion, what is the future of the space exploration in the new space era?
Fermín, can you repeat that, because I lost you in between?
No problem. Yeah, I just ask you that, what is the future of the space exploration in the new space era?
I think the future is looking interesting, right? So one thing that is, as I mentioned, that is happening today is that unlike the Cold War, where you had very few countries and state-funded programs that invested in space development, and was very much focused on developing space from a national security perspective, right? Commercialization was not the key. Today, the future of space is looking actually quite exciting. You have several commercial companies that are engaging in space capability. Some of them are very successful. For example, SpaceX with reusable capability, right, and Blue Origin. You have India now, which has come out and said that it will privatize its entire space ecosystem. So India is moving from a state-funded, state-manufactured rocket satellite ecosystem to becoming private. Everything will be made private, right? Which itself is an amazing development. So the future, I think, will be such. And this is what we also project in our book, Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, is that there will be a race between the major spacefaring nations like US, China, Japan, India, to demonstrate to the world who has the more attractive representation structure in kind of building the space ecosystem, right? And then China and Russia will also have an interesting future where they will point out that they have the resources and the capability to do this. And then I think finally with commercialization of space, you will have the ability of people around the world ability to participate in space, right? Today, you know, Fermín, space is a very non-democratic domain. And I say this because think of a situation that if I want to go to space, right, I just cannot afford it. The ticket to get to space on a commercial spacecraft is about $52 million, right? One seat. I just cannot afford that. because it's too expensive. And it's also astronauts are very state, determined and funded. I think the future is that because we will have reusable rockets like Starship, China is also building a reusable rocket called Long March 9, which they hope to get into service by 2030. The ability to access space will come down. The price will come down. And then the future will be that several more of us will actually contribute realistically to the space economy, and that space will become a lot about economic development, contribution to societal development, as well as, for example, Mexico, right? Mexico, I see in the next 20 years, creating a space ecosystem that builds Mexico's national capability, for example, navigation, communication, satellite internet. I'm sure there are areas in Mexico where internet is not very good because of fiber. India has the same problem. I come from Northeast India. Internet is very bad because the fiber network is not very good. So the future is that you will have large constellations that will support satellite internet and bring down the cost, that millions of us can then access very good communication system as well. So that's the future I see in terms of space exploration and development.
And it is really interesting to hear you talking about the importance of the national interests in terms of geopolitical issues. How do you locate Japan among the US, China, and Russia, for example?
Oh, great question. So Japan recently issued a national security strategy in 2022. So for the first time, Japan, historically has a constitution that talks about, especially Article 9, that tells you that Japan cannot invest in offensive military capability, which is connected to your question of national security and interest. I think fast forward about 2008, when China tested its anti-satellite weapon in 2007, where it killed one of its own satellites and created about 3,000 pieces of debris, Japan woke up because Japan's navy, Japan's military is dependent on satellite communication for navigation, as well as for missile tracking, right? And what is interesting is that when I locate Japan now, for your question as to where it is, say, if you locate it between US, China, Russia, Japan is a very serious space power. Right? Japan has independent launch capability. Japan has established a separate space domain unit. The latest Japanese national security strategy that they issued in 2022 talks about the development of event counter-strike capability. And this is an interesting change because usually Japan was very careful about saying that every activity that they do in terms of military activity is about defense, right? Defending the homeland. But now they're saying that because of the development of capabilities like hypersonic missile, for example, and also China's investment, for example, in an orbital bombardment system, it's very important to have the capability to have counter-strike that can, the radar capability that can, first of all, see those hypersonic glide vehicle, which is very difficult today. And Japan wants to have that capability because it worries about a future where its own ability to sustain as a power is going to come down. And we see what is happening, for example, in the Taiwan Straits, right? There is escalation of conflict today. And Japan is worried about that. So I would say that I would locate Japan very high in terms of space capability. Japan's ability to move its forces, its ability to use space for communication, its ability to launch to space is very high. And so I would put it right up there with US, China, and Russia.
I agree with you. Absolutely. Japan is very concerned about Taiwan issue. So it is a special question we have to follow up in the next months. And very soon, Secure World Foundation will release its global space counter space capabilities. So it will be interesting to see how is this issue on the table. Well, we are finished this talk, and let's ask you a final reflection on this, my dear Namrata.
Sorry, what did you say? I didn't understand that.
I ask you to give us a final reflection on this talk.
Oh yeah, sure. So I think finally I would say to your audience that this is the right time, actually, even for a country like Mexico, to have a very clear space policy and space goal, right? Because as you see from Japan, if you think about how Japan has instituted its own space launch system, how it's developing its commercial capability, it's because they took decisions in 2008 with their basic space policy that they're going to do this commercialization. Because as you know, Fermín, space takes a long time to be developed. It's a very critical scientific technology. You need the skill sets to do it, right? And so I think I would end by saying that for countries, including Mexico, to play a very important role, space is, first of all, becoming a critical infrastructure. All of us depend on space, right? For your ATM transactions, you depend on space. For your e-commerce, you depend on space. All of us use global positioning system. How do you think we get that? It's from 4 different satellites, right? Then for your communication, for your direct TV, you use space. So I would say that given this future where space economy, which is about $400 billion today, is projected 400 billion, is projected to become about $1 trillion by 2030. And if we add space resources, several hundred trillions, right? So this is the right time to create a clear space policy, space goal, like Japan, even for a country like Mexico, to take advantage of the space future that is coming in the next 10, 15 years. So the time is now for me to do it. So I'll end with that.
I really appreciate the recommendation, and I will share this with the people in the Mexican Space Agency. So it was a really good talk with you, and let's keep in touch.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. It's an honor.
It's an honor also for me. Thank you very much. And for my audience, next Saturday we will have Ian Grossner as a guest. Probably you know Ian Grossner. He's from Brazil. Well, Brazil, Austria, and he's going our next special guest.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, see you on the next Saturday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.